suppose, monks, there was a tree with perfect branches and leaves. Its bark will fully develop, and its inner bark, its sapwood and heartwood, will fully develop. In the same way, monks, for one of virtuous conduct and perfect in virtue, the precondition of freedom from remorse is perfected. When there is freedom from remorse, for one of perfect freedom from remorse, the precondition of gladness is perfected. Likewise, the precondition of joy, relaxation, happiness, right integration, knowledge and vision of what is actually the case, dispassion, disenchantment, and knowledge and vision of liberation are all perfected. So this is a discourse by the Buddha from the Anguttara Nikaya. It's called Preconditions. So it's about a series of preconditions for the realization of liberation or awakening. And it starts with this lovely image of a tree coming to full growth. When the conditions are right, are present, in this case, having perfect branches and leaves, then with these conditions, the tree's bark will develop, its inner bark, its sapwood, and its heartwood will fully develop. There's actually another version of this discourse preserved in Chinese translation. And in that version, instead of the Buddha saying that suppose there was a tree with perfect branches and leaves, it says, suppose its roots are undamaged. Suppose this tree's roots are undamaged, then its bark will fully develop, its inner bark, its heartwood will fully develop. I think that's an even nicer version of this simile. So I want to give I want to talk about this metaphor of a tree becoming fully grown as a metaphor for spiritual life, of complete spiritual development. This is a metaphor, you could say, for the spiritual ideal of full flourishing, the ideal of humans fully coming alive, fully becoming the living beings that they could be. So a tree becoming fully grown is a simple way to visualize the much more complicated and almost impossible task of visualizing what it is for human beings to mature into their full spiritual size, you could say. But it's useful to have these kinds of metaphors to picture what is difficult to imagine. And by starting in that way, I want to get us thinking about what is a spiritual ideal of full flourishing? What does it look like? And what can we do with it? How can it have an impact on our lives? How can it become something? How can a spiritual ideal become something which guides our lives? So this is to talk about Buddhism, but also it's for me to talk more generally, I think, about how to approach the Buddhist spiritual ideal. And I want to sort of refer from time to time to the idea of philosophy as a way of life. This is something I'm very passionate about, I think, the idea that even in our Western culture, we've got parallels to the Buddhist spiritual path in the form of philosophy as a way of life. Philosophy meaning the search for wisdom. Not necessarily involving theoretical knowledge alone. In fact, definitely not involving the quest for some kind of theoretical knowledge, but rather the quest for wisdom itself. This is what we mean by philosophy as a way of life. This is what the ancient Greeks meant by philosophy as a way of life. And for these ancient Greeks philosophers who followed philosophy as a way of life, they took it for granted that human beings, there's an aim for human life. There's a goal, a purpose of human life. And they call this Eudaimonia, which literally means having a good daimon, or sort of inner spirit. And in practice, this means complete flourishing. What is it to flourish as a human being? To enjoy a kind of overall excellence. Sometimes eudaimonia is translated happiness, but if we translate the goal of human life as happiness, it can sound like an emotional state or feeling, whereas eudaimonia is an active participation in life that might be happy, but more than anything, it's involved and it's fully alive, and it's an ideal of being satisfied and happy through living the best way one can. So I want to link up a bit Buddhist spiritual ideals with eudaimonia. But I thought I'd just start by suggesting that even to talk of a spiritual ideal is to hold in our minds some kind of image. And it's a bit like looking at a recipe book. You know, when you open a recipe book, and a really nice recipe book has got these beautiful photographs of the complete dish, yeah? And there's, I mean, not too overdone, but when the food is pictured in an attractive way, such that you think, oh yes, that's what I want to cook. Now, of course, when you've engaged in this process of cooking, when you've started your cooking process, you find, I don't have the nutmegs, or I don't quite have chili flavoured oil or something. And so you have to make something up. And so what comes out the other end might be a dish that looks a bit different, or it's slightly burned on one side, you know, because your oven always does that or something. And yet, when you serve it up to your friends who've come around for dinner, it tastes fantastic anyway. Yeah? So recipes have this purpose of getting us interested in cooking, in producing an end result in the future, and yet it may or may not bear much resemblance to what comes out at the other end. This is Dhivan's simile of recipes, and I've got this going at the moment. I suppose I wanted to also start by just throwing in this idea that we've got this theme on this festival of evolution or extinction. I want to throw in the thought, do you think this is a good choice? I wonder if it isn't philosophically a false dilemma. Yeah? That means, you know, it sounds like, well, is it evolution or extinction? Evolution? I guess, yes. But is it true that it's either or? This is what I'm wondering. In the sense that, well, evolution, of course, means the development of species characteristics overall. You know, for humans, big brains, bipedal, hairless, except for heads and so on. So, you know, we've evolved as human beings to look like this. That's our species characteristic. Now, what we... it's not all that likely we're going to become extinct, as it were. The biggest danger is more like the end of civilization. I mean, that's a serious issue, really, isn't it? If we continue with using up the Earth's resources in an unsustainable way, there won't be the basis for human civilization that we've had. And I think that's the real issue. And in that sense, evolution can only be a metaphor for individuals developing spiritually. And a sort of spiritual evolution is the evolution of the individual rather than the species. I'm throwing this in as a fussy kind of philosopher who didn't quite like the false dilemma of the theme. But yes, I better stop there. So, going back to our metaphor, our simile of a tree coming into full development. The Buddha used it as an image for a natural process of human spiritual development. A natural process of condition following condition. Now, in the Triratna Buddhist tradition, our teacher Sangharakshita calls this sequence of stages the spiral path. The spiral path, the stages of a path that spirals out of the wheel of life and culminates in awakening. So that's another image for this sequence. I'm not going to talk about the spiral nature of this path though today. I just want to focus on the idea of a sequence of stages. It begins with the stage of virtuous conduct, resulting in freedom from remorse. Virtuous conduct and freedom from remorse are the condition for a series which include gladness, joy, relaxation, happiness, and integration. There are other discourses where the starting point for this series are slightly different. In one well-known discourse, the starting point is faith, Shraddha, a kind of foretaste, you could say, of the whole of the resulting series of stages of the path. And this discourse that starts from faith, I think, is very important in that what we mean by faith, Shraddha, or confidence, is a glimpse, a foretaste, you could say, of the goal of Buddhist spiritual life, of awakening. This is like looking at that recipe in the recipe book, although it might be very different for all of you. I remember when I was a teenager, a little foretaste I had of the Buddhist spiritual life was going out for a walk one night and looking up at the starry sky and being struck by our place in the universe. So here we are, also caught up in our human dramas. There I was, as a teenager, worrying about O-levels or whatever I was doing at that time, teenage romances going wrong and so on, and looking up at the starry sky, I had a sense of this vast universe, and here is the earth on which we are living. We've somehow evolved and emerged as in a context in which we are not the most, there's a vast significance, there's a vastness to the whole universe in which our absorption in small details seems quite inappropriate. And that little glimpse at that moment gave me a sense of, there must be something bigger going on for human beings than an absorption in small-scale human dramas. And that made me open, I think, to appreciate the possibility, when I later read Buddhist books, the possibility of a spiritual life, of a Dharma life, that through which one can develop, through which one can grow into something unknown, perhaps. So this series of factors or or stages on the path to awakening can start from faith, it can start from virtuous conduct and freedom from remorse, or it can start from mindfulness and clear knowing. In other discourses, the path starts from mindfulness. Perhaps we need all these features, all these factors in place for the path to develop. The series gladness, joy, relaxation, happiness, integration are a series which it's really important we don't take literally in the sense of it's somehow necessary for us to achieve these stages in order to make progress. Much more the point is that faith, virtuous conduct, mindfulness are the conditions for these further stages of the integration process, the process of becoming fully unified to take place. So if we're interested in developing a fully unified, integrated psyche, the thing to focus on is virtuous conduct and mindfulness. And with these factors of integration in place, unfolds the final set of factors, the insight series, knowledge and vision of what is actually the case, disenchantment, dispassion, liberation, and knowledge and vision of liberation, which is a way of talking about awakening, nirvana. So again, the point's not so much to think, I have to practice these stages in this order, but rather that knowledge and vision of what is actually the case, and so on, have as their condition a unified, integrated psyche. So, just as a tree to come to full growth needs its bark to be in good condition, or its roots to be undamaged, likewise, for someone who would like to develop insight, it's necessary to develop a unified, integrated psyche, which is capable of fully absorbing the vastness of the night sky, or our sudden realization of the impermanence of conditioned existence, and becomes able to live with those insights so that they change us. So I'm trying to evoke quite a big topic here, this topic of the path to awakening. But I want to carry on by just dwelling on the image of a tree more as a way of paying attention to the ideal itself, the ideal of spiritual development. The image of a tree becoming fully grown is an image of a living being reaching maturity. So it's a neat image for the Buddha to use, because trees start out as acorns or beech mast or seeds of various sorts. And then they increase in size till they reach their full stature. It's very visible. Even in our lifetimes, we can see a tree making progress towards its becoming fully grown. And while this is an image of individual maturing and growth, which we might respond to, the ideal of a tree becoming fully grown is also suggestive of a mature tree which itself becomes strong and long-lasting. So a mature tree isn't simply the fine result of a process of growth. A mature tree is itself an image for something strong, which lasts through time, which and becomes a blessing for other beings. That's where I'm going with all this. A mature tree becomes, in fact, an active contributor for the flourishing of other species around it. This is well known, but I looked it up to get the right number. A mature oak tree supports 284 species of insect. So a mature oak tree is a tremendous home for other living beings. Unfortunately, a holly tree only supports 7 species of insects. So we've got to pick our trees here. You know, if we picked holly as our spiritual ideal, we might be picking a narrower ideal than we might like. So let's stick with oak trees. So high in the foliage of an oak tree lives the purple hairstreak butterfly. Has anyone seen a purple hairstreak butterfly? Nobody. That's because they live in the top of oak trees. Nobody sees them because humans don't live in the top of oak trees. They're very beautiful. They're a very rich purple colour, and they really don't come down very low. They're quite hard to see. But I'm told, my butterfly book tells me, that purple hairstreak butterflies are to be found. So likewise, a fully flourishing human being might support forms of beauty which are not immediately apparent to the ordinary undeveloped being, perhaps. I'm sort of suggesting a sort of mystery to what it is to a mystery about the spiritual deal of what it is to become a fully developed human being. Just as it's actually a little bit mysterious what it is to be an oak tree fully developed. So there's that kind of comparison perhaps between the spiritual ideal for human beings and a tree. And yet, here's where it doesn't quite work. Human physical development peaks around age 30, if you're lucky. So at age 30 we're at our strongest physically, perhaps at our most confident intellectually. I'm not sure about that. But past 30, it's all downhill, yeah, for human beings, physically. I mean, we can keep healthy and we can keep doing our daily exercises, which Matt was getting me to talk about, so that one can stay reasonably healthy.
He does handstands every day.
Handstands as spiritual practice, that's the secret. So for human beings, physical development just doesn't carry on. We have to, resolve ourselves one way or another with our inevitable physical decline. But our stature can keep on developing, not in our physical form, but in how we live, in our active engagement with life. That's what we mean by human spiritual development, in our continuing to develop our active form of life, which includes, of course, our ethical practice, but should also include how we work on our own minds, our own thoughts. We're all familiar with, as we get older, the habitual nature of our thoughts and emotions. So without engaging in some form of spiritual practice through which we start to shift the momentum of our inner lives, it gets more difficult as we get older. Never impossible, of course, but it's what we mean by practicing a spiritual life is attending to this active engagement with how we live, attending to our own thoughts, our private lives, and our participation in human civilization, how we participate in this great human adventure of civilization. So our image of a tree leads us beyond just subjective individual development into much bigger considerations of what is it to be a human being fully flourishing in relation to other beings. And The word eudaimonia has this same, for the Greeks, has exactly this same sense of flourishing in the Greek sense, in the context of the polis, the city-state in which an ancient Greek completely would find his or her identity. So what is it to be a human being? It's to be a political animal, as Aristotle said, someone who lives in the polis, someone who lives with other human beings in a civilized way. So eudaimonia means flourishing together. This is helpful because it's not always so obvious from the Buddhist ideal of enlightenment or nirvana that this is not supposed to be an individual achievement just for ourselves. That might be an inspiring vision at a certain point, but it's not supposed to be an ideal just for ourselves. It's often said in the early discourses that the whole point of the Buddha's long training for awakening is said to be over many lifetimes, but even in this lifetime, the Buddha's training for awakening was solely for the welfare and happiness of all beings. That was the Buddha's purpose, you could say. That was his aim in life. It was nirvana, awakening, but that itself has got a purpose, a wider context of compassion for beings. And there's a story that the Buddha needed to be asked to teach after his awakening. This is quite a famous one, that the Buddha thought it would be quite a hassle to teach the Dharma, because after all it's quite difficult to understand. And it took the intervention of a god, Brahma Sahampati, to persuade the Buddha to teach. But I like to think this is really a story, the main point of which is to show that God was a Buddhist. So the early Buddhists had this kind of religious kind of task in hand to create a Buddhist culture. And what better way to create a Buddhist culture than to convert God to Buddhism? Because after the Buddha started, so the Buddha was always committed to teaching for the welfare of beings. And after he'd started teaching, and after the first 60 disciples reached arahantship, reached nirvana, it said, the Buddha gathered them and said, go out and teach for the benefit, the welfare and benefit of living beings. So for those first disciples, the point of this human spiritual ideal of nirvana was to share it with others and to start to create, to continue to spread the spiritual ideal of Buddhism. Going back to our image of a tree, the word that's used in the Pali language for full development, I've talked about the full development of a tree, is paripuri. Paripuri. So it's a word that, like words in foreign languages usually are, it doesn't translate exactly into English in one form. So I've used this word full development because that fits with a tree. But it also means complete fulfillment, or even overflowing. So the tree has become the most tree it can become. It's become fulfilled as a tree. Likewise, these factors of the path that the Buddha taught, each is the condition for the next in a sequence which leads from unsatisfactoriness of ordinary existence to the knowledge of liberation, each fulfilling the next. So it's not that mindfulness is simply the condition for joy, in the sense of, if you're interested in joy, you need mindfulness. It's that mindfulness reaches its fulfillment in gladness and joy. That's how it overflows, as it were. And there's another metaphor here, another simile. The Buddha compared the sequence of stages to water flowing. Here it is. Just as, monks, when it rains huge drops on the tops of mountains, the water pouring down the slopes fills up the branching clefts of mountain gullies. The full-up branching clefts of mountain gullies fill up ponds. The full-up ponds fill up lakes. The full-up lakes fill up streams. The full-up streams fill up rivers, and the full-up rivers fill up the great ocean, the sea. Likewise, and then the Buddha runs through once again this series of factors from faith to knowledge of liberation. So here, the image here, it's the same word, paripuri, complete fulfillment in relation to the tree, in relation to flowing water, the overflowing of conditions. States overflow into states, the Buddha says. States fulfill states to lead from here to the beyond. So instead of a tree growing, exactly the same word is used for the image of water flowing stage by stage to the ocean in a natural process. How could it be otherwise that water naturally flows when it fills up, when a pond fills up, that it flows out onward into the river? So this image suggests constant flowing, transcending of conditions, a natural flowing movement towards a goal. The goal, in this case, of reaching the sea. So here, reaching the sea is the image for becoming fully grown, reaching full development of a spiritual ideal. This is a bit mysterious, isn't it? The ideal of nirvana compared to a great ocean in which all rivers flow and where they merge and each lose their identity in the great ocean. So there's the River Thames, the River Severn, the River Dart, and so on, all flowing to the sea. And when they reach the sea, they lose their individual identities and just become sea. It can sound like this means that individual Buddhist practitioners somehow lose their identity when they reach nirvana. But I don't think this can at all be what the Buddha meant. We somehow all disappear into some sort of oceanic Buddha mind or something. So I think this couldn't be what's meant, because the Buddha's well known for praising the qualities of his individual disciples. So there's a whole series of praises in the Anguttara Nikaya. So he praised Dhammadinna for being foremost amongst those who speak on the teaching. So Dhammadinna was the foremost female monastic. He praised Samavati for being foremost of those who dwell in love. Isn't that lovely? Amongst his female lay disciples. He praised Surambhatta for being foremost of those with confirmed confidence amongst his male lay disciples. He praised Sariputta for being foremost in wisdom amongst the male monastics. So all these enlightened, awake early arahants, whether monastic or lay, female or male, were praised for their unique individual characteristics. So I think the Buddha's point is more subtle about the rivers flowing into the sea. It's that just as rivers flow into the sea, so an individual's awakened mind goes beyond individual limits. So all of us have perceived limits of what we can do, our energy, our insights, our capacity to influence the world, help others, and so on. An individual's awakened mind goes beyond all those limits, enters into a life of compassionate activity that's simply the nature and the goal of the awakened mind. There you go. That's just my my offering for how to understand this image of flowing into the ocean. Maybe this image of fulfillment, though, of just as water reaches its fulfillment by reaching the sea, this image of pari-puri as fulfillment helps us revisit our tree image again. So not only is a mature tree a home for many beings, except holly trees, but a mature tree is also now fully and actively a participant in the great interconnected web of life. So its roots, the roots of an oak tree, extend very deep, perhaps into the groundwater. They extend very wide. So these roots bring water to the surface. And so trees, even in a drought, can keep flourishing, offering a home for other living beings. At the same time, these roots bind the soil into a resilient sort of layer which can absorb water, stopping flooding. Binds the soil ready for the worms to come along and leaven, ready for plants to grow in. And the strong trunk of a tree lifts this leafy canopy of oak leaves up into the air, creating shadows that breaks up the hot sun, creates a kind of microclimate, it's said, creating conditions for more life to flourish. So this too is to be fully grown, to be awakened. This is also flourishing, or eudaimonia, to just by fulfilling your own potential for development or awakening, is to become a kind of being who's a real boon for other beings. I'm going to push this metaphor of the tree a bit further, just to say, well, perhaps the mature tree is not actually any longer separate from the rest of life. It's no longer struggling for competition in the forest floor like trees have to do, but instead has become a net contributor to life, to the well-being of the whole. So whereas a young tree needs very particular conditions to flourish, young tree needs water and light and earth and not to be disturbed, for its bark to be not damaged. The mature tree, in a certain way, becomes the creator of its own conditions. It has the strength and resilience to be quite strong and independent, and to bring up its own water, to create its own microclimate, to be a home for creatures that in another way that also sort of flourish and help it be a flourishing tree. So you see where I'm going with that image. Perhaps the image of a tree coming to full growth gives us a sense of awakening, the spiritual ideal of one of a full maturity, which actually in a certain sense becomes independent of the conditions which were at first needed for us to get established, to begin to develop ourselves. There's a kind of fulfillment which is dependent on everything that went before, and yet is now somewhat independent, or resilient enough, well, much more resilient than we were when we were younger. I've got notes which are in the wrong order, and I've had to shift them round. Or I wanted to shift them round to talk, but now I have to do that and remember where I am. So, but I think I'm there. There's another discourse. This follows on very much from this discourse, these discourses about a tree coming to full development, of water flowing. It's a different angle on the same sequence. Is it necessary to be willful? This is the title of this discourse. The Buddha says, for someone who is ethical, monks, for someone established in virtuous conduct, it is not necessary to be willful, wishing, may I have freedom from remorse. It is natural, monks, that for someone who is ethical and who is established in virtuous conduct, that freedom from remorse arises. And likewise, the Buddha explains that for someone who is free from remorse, which is to say you're ethically completely up together without regrets, you're established in a pretty good ethical practice and you've sorted out the mistakes you've made as best you can. For someone free from remorse, it's not necessary to be willful, wishing, may I experience joy. It's natural that for someone who is established in freedom from remorse, there's joy. And similarly, it's natural that happiness arises, relaxation arises, that the mind, the heart, the psyche becomes unified. It's not necessary to be willful, wishing, may my mind become unified. It's natural that that state of unification arises when the conditions are in place. And on through all this sequence. Again, the Buddha says, in this way, states overflow into states. States fulfill states in order to go from here to the beyond. So here, there's definitely a spiritual ideal of liberation, of awakening being put forward. But the Buddha's making the point that you don't need, the way to handle this spiritual ideal is not to think, may I become awakened? May I attain this wonderful spiritual maturity? I mean, you can think that, but it's not really going to help. It's not necessary to, in fact, to be willful in that way. What's necessary is simply to practice the stage of the path which you need to practice, whether that's ethics, or whether that's meditation, or whether that's insight practice. And the Buddha gives a metaphor for this. This is our fourth metaphor, isn't it? Yes. Suppose there was a hen with 8 or 10 or 12 eggs. That's a lot of eggs for a hen, isn't it? Isn't it like 4 usually? Suppose there's a hen with a lot of eggs. And that hen had properly sat on them, properly kept them warm, properly incubated them. And though the wish might not arise in that hen, oh, that my little chicks would break through the shells of their eggs with the sharp tips of their claws and hatch out safely. Those little chicks are nevertheless capable of breaking through the shells of their eggs with the sharp tips of their claws and hatching safely. For what reason? Because the hen properly sat on them, properly kept them warm, properly incubated them. Likewise, for a practitioner who is devoted to development, though the wish might not arise, oh, may my mind be liberated. Nevertheless, their mind becomes liberated. And why is that? Because they've practiced the 4 establishments of mindfulness, the Noble Eightfold Path, and so on. Actually, in the discourse, the Buddha goes through the metaphor again, saying, even if the hen did wish, oh, may my chicks break out of their shells and to be hatched safely. That's not what does it. It doesn't matter. Just by sitting on the eggs in the right way, the little chicks hatch out. So this metaphor gives us a sense of how to handle a spiritual ideal of being fully grown. Say we're really inspired by the idea of enlightenment, of awakening, perhaps inspired by this image of a tree being fully grown, or perhaps the great ocean of nirvana. That doesn't mean that we have to impose that ideal on our experience thinking, may I become awakened, enlightened. Rather, it's like that recipe in a recipe book. You could think, I really want to cook one that looks as good as that. But actually, how do you do that? You simply follow the instructions. Yeah, you gather the ingredients, and then you start at the beginning of the method. The ingredients of faith and Dharma teaching and spiritual community, perhaps, and you start on the method. First step, practice ethics. Mix the ingredients and so on. Do you see what I mean? And so on. That's all you need to do. In order to cook the perfect quiche, all you need to do is follow the recipe in the right order. It doesn't help thinking, may I cook the perfect quiche? In fact, that would slightly muck it up, wouldn't it? Because then you wouldn't be satisfied with your very particular quiche that you finish with. This image of it's not necessary to be willful. The word the Buddha uses for it is natural that for someone who's virtuous, joy arises, is dhammata. It's or dharmata in Sanskrit. It's the nature of dharma. It's the simply how dharma is that for somebody who practices ethics, they will be happy. You should translate that, it's natural, it's to be expected. But I think it's significant that it's the nature of dharma. It's the nature of reality, that this is how things are. So this idea that the spiritual path arises on conditions and unfolds is the nature of this human reality that we live in. This is the Dharma. We can trust this Dharma. I wanted to go on to talk about the importance of having a view of reality which supports our idea of our spiritual ideal. I think I'm running out of time a bit. But I wanted just to throw in how I watched this Brian Cox series on the planets. Did anybody else watch this Brian Cox series? It was okay, wasn't it? It's good, yeah. And I really appreciated how what was offered there was a lot of scientific knowledge turned into stories. He basically took all this knowledge that's been gathered by scientists about the planets, from Mars right through to Pluto, and retold all this as a story of the solar system. It's a story of which we are part. Once you put the facts into the form of a story, it turns out that the incredibly unlikely conditions which led to life on Earth are a story of which we are the culmination. That story involves Jupiter being the solar system's bad boy to ending up being a sort of protective guardian of the Earth from asteroids crashing into the planet and destroying all life. He does things like that. It's very well done, and it made me consider the role of stories in our lives. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of a story of what it is to be human, which makes it evident, really obvious to us that it's simply how this reality is. That human beings are the universe become aware of itself. There's no sort of simpler way of putting it, I don't think, that simply being a human, to be self-aware in this way, is to be the universe becoming aware of itself and hence able to develop towards a spiritual ideal. And in doing that, we're fulfilling, in some sense, reality as an interconnected whole. I could put that in a rather new agey or deterministic way, but there's no need to do that. From the Buddhist point of view, it takes a lot of effort. It takes effort, it takes commitment. And only we can make the effort to develop ethics, to develop meditation, and so on, to really fulfill this potential of the universe. So I'm just going to end, really, at that point by making the point that in a way, in this situation in which our human civilization is actually at a turning point of danger, perhaps, with this threat to the broad ecosystem in which we live, and our unsustainable attitude to the resources of the earth. At the same time, our human civilization offers us tremendous potential to develop ourselves individually. Like small trees, needing conditions to grow and develop. They're all present for us at the moment. Here we are at this fantastic festival, the product of so much, in a way, high-level civilization, of organisation and love and care. These conditions are present. By making the most of them, it's possible for us to start to develop, to become what we can, to become as fully grown as ourselves as we come, to reach a human fulfillment. So this is an individual journey. Each of us individually will step into this deepening of awareness and wisdom. And in that sense, what it means for life to flourish on this earth will become more and more aware and apparent. So I'll end with just a plea. Let's not waste this precious opportunity to develop.